Welcome to the Unworthy Leader Podcast. Thank you for joining us today. It means so much that you're carving out time in your busy schedules to reflect, grow, and lead with greater intention. Just by being here, you're already doing something wonderful for yourself. If you're new to this space, I'm Kendra Dahlstrom. I years guiding executives at some of the world's top companies through high-stakes change, all while I privately battled, am I enough? And so I like this space for real conversations about self-doubt, fear, and the pressure to perform. And these are the conversations that rarely make it to the boardroom, the conference room, or the water cooler. The intention of this podcast is to change that. So for those of you returning, thank you for being here. And today's guest, I'm super excited about. His name is Johnny Anderson, and he is actually a host of a fellow podcast called the Impodsters. And I love that this topic is becoming more and more popular and heating up in this space. I thought you would make a wonderful guest, not only because we have a mutual acquaintance in common. I felt like we connected definitely on the same page in terms of how we view this whole topic, how we personally work through it ourselves and then witnessed and helped leaders work through it themselves. And you also just happen to be a fellow Tennessean. Thank you for being here, Johnny. It's so wonderful to have you.
Kendra, thank you for having me.
So let's take us back a little bit and into the story of Johnny and Johnny growing up and why this topic is now relevant for where you are in your life.
I always go back and, there's the critique of general psychology around always taking it back to your mom and dad, but that's where we're going to go. Let's start back with mom and dad. Dad was a mechanic. Mom was a housewife. We were in a blue collar family. It was a great childhood. My story didn't start at any level of major trauma or abuse or anything along those lines. And I know that people that suffer with imposter phenomenon often, there is a high preponderance of that. But for me, it was really more, I think, a blue collar ideology. In some of the work that I do, I actually use the term blue collar pathology. And the idea was, without really even knowing or understanding, there was this almost self-imposed case system that was not really always stated out loud, but was sort of right under the radar, that kept us from really feeling comfortable in certain situations or around certain people, whether it be economic class or even physical neighborhoods. And so I think it began there. And then my career path, I was lucky to get into sales and technology sales. And really, someone pulled me off a forklift and said, "Hey, dummy, don't you know you're a salesperson?" And I got into technology at kind of a right time. And what I found myself with is being in the wrong room a lot, being in rooms I didn't deserve to be in a lot, and not really having the skill set to navigate through to say, no, you do belong here. You are okay here. I was very comfortable grew up in East Nashville in a very mid to lower mid class economic situation, but find yourself in the boardroom, as you mentioned, and talk about in the boardroom and in the office and in the white collar world, and just didn't really have the skill sets to navigate through. These conversations were happening, so didn't have the skill sets to navigate through some of those feelings of, you do not belong here.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And the first thing I want to reflect back to is I love that you called it imposter phenomenon. And I'd love for you to share the story around that with the audience.
Well, I was corrected. I told you, salesperson. So salespeople were trained that when you want something and you have a phone number, you pick up the phone and you call and you ask for the thing that you're wanting. And I was doing my research on 1978 article that started this whole conversation with Dr. Pauline Clance and Dr. Suzanne Imes. And I found my way to Pauline's information, read the article, kind of wandered through some online things that were talking about Dr. Clance. And then I found my way to her website. I don't know if I should be telling everybody this, but there's a website, and there's a phone number on it. And so I saw the phone number and I thought, why not? So I picked up the phone and I called. And Dr. Clance answered on the second ring. And so I had something written out because I was very scared I was going to fanboy all over her. And, here I have the opportunity to talk to the person that coined the term. And so hi, I'm Johnny Anderson. I have a podcast called The Imposters. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'd love for you to be on my podcast. And she, it was a nice response. She kind of laughed And she said, "Oh, honey, I don't do that anymore." And so it was crushing because I thought what a coup it would be to have her on. But she said, "Yeah, honey, I don't do that anymore," which I can respect. It told me more about a place where she was in life. She's 85 years old, so she doesn't do that type of thing anymore. But she did talk to me. I mean, she was gracious with her time and she was warm and welcoming, and we talked. And at one point, I did say, I used the term imposter syndrome, and I don't think she corrected me initially, but somewhere along the line, she said, "Well, you do know it's imposter phenomenon," was the phrase that was originally in the article. And since then, I've actually learned the importance of the differences between those terms and why certain
Mm-hmm.
psychologists react negatively to the term syndrome. What
Mm-hmm.
a great experience to speak to the OG of Dr. Pauline Clance that coined the phrase and began this thing that now almost 30, 40, 50 years later that we're really talking about, and is having a resurgence that you and I talked about at one point.
Yeah, yeah, and I definitely want to cover that. I want to get to that, but I wanted you to share the story because I think it's such a cool story and such an important thing for the audience to hear the distinction as we start to think about phenomenon, something that happens that's can at some point be unexplained. We don't really, understand. We're still learning more about it, and it's just an occurrence versus a syndrome is almost like a death sentence, right? I mean, syndrome usually parlays with health crises and epidemics of serious magnitude. So I love that thought around the reframing. I personally have found myself, just for my own personal comfort, I like the term imposter thoughts, because then for me, it really helps me frame this idea that it's just a thought. I don't have to believe it. I don't have to listen to it. It can be fleeting. So for me, that works. But I love that story, Johnny. And thank you for sharing with us about your background. As you started to navigate moving from blue collar into white collar and being in some of those conference rooms and boardrooms, as you mentioned, if you were to reflect back, what do you feel like was the one part of yourself that you had to work the hardest to hide?
Wow, it's a good question, and I don't know that the right answer is the imposter is sort of
Mm,
the answer, but it's that pathological level of self doubt that was a consistent and constant voice in the back of my head.
mm,
And in situations, and I talked a little bit about the sales career, there was a second phase, probably the phase where I'm at now, and that's I became a business owner and entrepreneur, and it really everything I'd learned up to that point to kind of handle and manage that internal imposter suddenly kicked into a new high gear when I became a business owner. Again, even so much more in a place I don't belong, in a room I don't need to be in and don't deserve and haven't earned, and all the things that imposter thoughts bring us to. But I would say just that hiding that constant voice in the back of my head telling me that you don't deserve, you don't belong. Hiding that was something that for the longest time was something that was the hardest thing for me to work on, to allow some of that to come out and to really start talking about it. I can point back to when that happened, when it actually occurred, where that hiding that voice, hiding that imposter, I didn't have a name for it at the time. I had not found my way to the concept of imposter thoughts, phenomenon, syndrome, whatever we call it. And I had a new business coach, and I was a brand new business owner, and we were having lunch, and I was telling him all the things I was navigating, and I was kind of first time sort of sharing this thing that had been the hardest thing for me to manage and through, and that voice in the back of my head. And he said, "Have you ever heard of imposter syndrome?" And I said, "No, I'm pretty sure I have it." And it was as though he reached in and twisted a lens that a part of my world just suddenly came into focus. That something I had seen for a very long time, but with very rough, fuzzy edges, came into focus. And then it allowed me to have a plan. I'm going to have this gentleman on my podcast that drops in on May 3rd, and we talk a little bit about that. But that was the journey of that hardest thing, about imposter syndrome was imposter syndrome, and
mm,
maybe not having the vocabulary, the vernacular initially at all. Not to mention that no tools, no coping mechanisms, but didn't even have the vocabulary. Maybe that's the better answer, is I didn't have the vocabulary
mm.
to address it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm also hearing, Johnny, that it was this iceberg moment. That, what lies beneath the water is so much bigger than what we see on top of the water. And oftentimes that part of the iceberg, it lands in the I don't know what I don't know category.
Yes.
And so you were operating with, it sounds like some, potential bias towards yourself. And then also this blind spot that you felt all these things, but you didn't really know what it was. And so thank goodness that you met that man and that he was able to shine that light for you. It sounds like in that moment you met with him, you realized what the cost of hiding this part of yourself, true or imagined, what that cost was.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, let's call them barriers, self-imposed, or really let's call it imposter imposed. One thing I mentioned, Chris Kelso, the gentleman that introduced it to me, he actually goes as so far as to call it the imposter. So not even thoughts or syndrome, anthropomorphized, personifies as the imposter. And that actually also from a framework level helps me sort of understand that as well. If I can literally turn it in this sort of somewhat adversary that I can picture as this, dark figure standing over in the corner. But there were the imposter, the side of me. There were so many self-imposed things, and we'll probably get to the conversation around therapy. But in therapy, there was something that there was a common theme that I think my therapist and I uncovered that was a big theme with my family, and it was, well, we don't do that sort of thing, and it was a self-limitation that was part of that blue collar. We don't hang with those people, we don't run with those people, we don't visit those things, we don't do that. And I think that was one thing that I started seeing was that the at the heart of that was a certain level of odd insecurity that for me manifested as that imposter phenomenon inside of my head. And it was a self-limitation. It was the biggest things that were holding me back was me. And I think the more I learned about imposter phenomenon, the more I learned about the vocabulary and then the coping tools, and then starting to work yourself out of it and get out of your own head, get out of your own way, come up with coping tools. So that those blocks started going away, and it's still a process, and I'm nowhere near completion, but at least I've taken the right steps, and I celebrate everyone that's working on this topic to help people that are in our shoes and that have suffered in the ways that we have and that have self-limited in the ways.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for doing it, and thank you for sharing those details. I have often worked with therapists myself that have framed it as, an entity or an alter ego and played with those different ideas. And I'm a big fan of let's just bring out our entire toolkit on this show, right? What works for you, what works for me, because the whole point is to share it with the listeners so that they can glean and grab onto what they think will work for them at the moment in time they're listening. And in a year or two, it may be a different guest that I have, and that idea may resonate. So that's the whole point of this. So I appreciate you getting detailed and sharing what worked for you. One thing I found, Johnny, and I'd like to know if you had this experience as well, is that when I started to actually really evaluate the voice, one element that really surprised me in that process through therapy and in my own healing process was the whole concept that it was actually trying to protect me from certain situations and things that would further the shame or the guilt, whatever I had going on deep down inside of me. And going back to our original conversation around a lot of it stems from inner child work. I'd love for you to share a little bit more, because I heard in your last answer some of the we don't hang out with them, we don't associate with them, and I'm making a hypothesis here, but my hypothesis would be, as I study human behavior, that there's a connection potentially between that and this protective coping mechanism that you put into place.
Yeah, we've talked on my show about the understandable fear of failure and how embracing failure is a necessary component. And fear of failure is a logical protective mechanism. If I don't do the thing, I don't fail. If I don't fail, I don't feel the experience. Therefore, I'm protected. One of the interesting ones we also talk about is fear of success.
It's just as
And it's
powerful.
just
Yes.
as powerful, right? And Kendra, you've seen, and you've had the way I found my way to you is through rather powerful person that I know, successful person that I know that's here in the greater Nashville area with me. And that fear of success is a strange one, but it is, if you look at the logical pathway for both of those mechanisms, are at core, they're protective by nature. They both attempt to keep you from, being in the spotlight, from putting your head on the chopping block. But there's also a strange dynamic that we talk about in a part of the coaching program that I'm working on that really focuses on that high level of highly performing individuals, C-level executives, entertainers, politicians, people that are really out in the forefront on a day-to-day basis, but have this paradoxical effect of the imposter. Statistics that I've read range, as right now does every statistic. I don't think we have enough reliable statistics on that. That's a different conversation. But the number I've seen is up to 37% of all C-level executives experience not just generalized self-doubt, not just that early phase of imposter syndrome or minor phase, but full-on crippling, always with me, pathological levels of self-doubt and inability to experience their successes. And so, along with those protective measures that come into play, isn't it interesting in that paradoxical nature of the desire to, and I think it's the desire to prove the voice wrong, the constant battle we're having to show that, and the need to feel the, hooray, I got the plaque, I made the success, I got the award, I closed the deal, sold the company, whatever it might be. And then I learned a fancy term, hedonic adaptation comes into play. And suddenly that, yay, and then you're right back into
That's right.
that baseline of now I've got to do something to make myself better. I spoke with a neuroscientist at an event yesterday, and we talked about something kind of fascinating, and it was the idea of the difference between the brain and the mind. And it made me understand, we talk a lot about the mind, and when I listen to, fellow podcasters, and when I read the books that people are putting on and the articles that people are writing about this topic, we talk a lot about the mind, but we don't talk as much about the brain. And she and I talked about, what is the dopamine component? What is the serotonin component that could make us predisposition to this? And is it even potentially some form of neurodivergence?
Yeah, and I even think epigenetics plays a role as well, because
I'll admit, I don't even know what that word
means. So it's this whole idea that, DNA is passed down from generation to generation. And so with that, so is trauma. And so how does that impact the brain? And how does that impact our neuroplasticity? And in my own personal experience, I've noticed it, as well as when I look at my generational family tree and the trauma that was carried down, I can definitely see some red threads that are very thick. And so again, I'm not an expert in this space, but these are things that I just continue to look at and study and hypothesize to get more and more information around the subject, much like you, Johnny. So that's why I so appreciate having you here. So I heard a few things in the story that you just had shared. One is that your leadership style started to crack open and change as you started to learn this about yourself. You started to change your approach and how you treat yourself. And so my assumption is, and I don't want to make an unfair assumption here, Johnny, but is that transverses into how you were treating others and how you led.
Yeah, largely in that I avoided leadership entirely, even when I was in a leadership position. I talk a little bit about this, but I was part of a leadership program that was created out of the Nashville Technology Council. One of the most impactful things I've ever been able to participate in. And from its original founding to today, I've had a very difficult time identifying myself. And at one point, I identified as, I am not a mentor, so don't call on me for such. And I am not really a leader in this sense. Like, I participate in the program, and yet here I was, helping build a leadership program, but completely not just reticent, but almost completely unwilling to call myself a leader at all, and absolutely unwilling to serve as a mentor, despite having an experience that could probably translate to some people that was a missed opportunity for both them and me. So I would say that would be how that really manifested, was in an avoidance of leadership, not just for a very long time. It's gotten better, and I'm doing some mentoring, and I'm allowing that that leader self to now begin to come out of the shadows. And yeah, it was funny because the first, it wasn't the way that it was most apparent in my leadership style is that I refused to be a leader.
Mm. So fascinating. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that, because this ties with your earlier comment about the statistics out there. And I think you had mentioned it's like 30% of C-suite. I can tell you from 20 years of working in Fortune 50 companies with SVP plus, and, which is SVPs in the C-suite level at some of the most recognized global brands and high-tech companies in the world, that I think it's closer to 80%. And I will tell you that probably 50% of them know it and admit it, and the other 50% show signs, symptoms. I could hypothesize. I would coach and treat around it, but we never really addressed it, because I can lead the horse to water, but if they don't, want to take a drink, then that's not my job as a coach, right? I need to hold space, and I need to meet them where they're at, while on occasion challenging them. But again, the unique thing with imposter syndrome or imposter thoughts is this idea that if you call it out too much, it actually exacerbates it. And then the clam goes back into its shell. So I'm sure you experienced that and been through that, but I just wanted to normalize that for you, because I heard that in your experience as well. And you were obviously a very high functioning leader and owned a business and sold a business. So this is something I see all day and night. And it stems from people not even wanting to hear the sound of their own voice and watching their MSNBC and Fortune magazine interviews. I mean, and these are some of the biggest leaders in the world. And they say, oh, it's because I don't have time. But then after we start talking, it really comes down to like, oh, I just hate the sound of my own voice. And it's too uncomfortable for me to watch. To the people who hate public speaking, they don't want to be on stages. They just do it because it's a burden of the job. To people who actually don't want to step in and lead teams. And where I see it show up the most, Johnny, just to, again, tie it back to your story, is this idea around conflict and challenging conversations. And my hypothesis on this, just based on my studies of human behavior, and again, I'm not a counselor or a psychologist, but being in this coaching space for as long as I have been, I believe that it's rooted to a trigger. So there's some sort of trigger from childhood or earlier in life where they don't like conflict. Conflict's scary. It compromises safety. It's bad. It may compromise my job, or I just don't want to hurt someone's feelings because it's a trigger for me, and they may be a people pleaser. So I'm not saying you're any one of those, but I just want to let you know how pervasive this is, and that everything you're sharing is obviously pervasive throughout this whole community, yet no one really talks about it, which is why I'm so excited that you have a podcast on the same subject, because I think there needs to be more of us.
We've talked on my show about insecurity. The general levels of insecurity, and how it's sort of a very small subset of the larger imposter phenomenon. But we've also talked about the offset of insecurity that really keeps, and it kept my experience, it kept me, and I also kind of see it in members of my family, where failure. I've seen so many wonderful leaders that I've worked with and that have coached me and that have mentored me really talk about that next step into becoming a leader is celebrating failure, as a step in the process. I feel like one thing, and this might tie into one of the questions you asked me earlier, but one thing that I find fascinating is how that growth becomes stunted and self-perpetuated when our insecurity, it keeps us from putting ourselves out there like we talked about and taking risks, and there's fear of success and fear of failure. But I think when we experience failure, how we experience failure, for most of my life, I think the training I had received was the insecurity was almost insurmountable. And so failure was something that just, you couldn't process it. You couldn't experience it in a healthy way. Failure was almost like an existential threat because of that lack of insecurity. And I had some great leaders over the years in my sales career, and then also as a business owner, that really helped me understand embracing failure as just an occurrence and a thing to celebrate and a step in the right direction. And what was really difficult was for me to be able to embrace that and experience failure, because that incredibly insecure past, it was incapable of having a relationship with failure that was a healthy relationship and that was in any way integrative of that failure, to be able to take that failure, integrate it in a healthy way, and then use it as a learning process. So you never learned from the failures, which is the best teacher. And so that phenomenon, unpacking that phenomenon and finding that out about myself, and that was something that I was not allowing myself to do, and why, that was something that once I put it into play, and I won't say, well, I'm cured of that. It's no, that's an inherent part of who I am. Now I just have the coping skills to try to recognize it, see it, and remediate it. So, but that was a powerful, powerful lesson of how to embrace failure as your friend and as a learning tool and as a tool. I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. And also in working with leaders at all levels, is that if you don't have a healthy foundation for your relationship with yourself and with things like failure, then everything is interpreted as I'm not good enough. Something's wrong with me. And that breeds insecurity because, especially in the workplace, that is how we get our money and how we pay our bills and our mortgage. And so then you feel, to your point, that it's an existential threat and your security is now threatened and your amygdala just fires up and you're in complete fight or flight mode. And so the thing that really helped me, Johnny, and I'm hearing this in your story as well, is that I had to really come to the sad yet liberating realization that I needed to create security for myself. I could not rely on any external system to create that for me. As much as I love my husband or anyone else, I had to figure out how to do that for myself.
That is, and I think that's so powerful, Kendra. That you have to meet the problem where it is, and it's inside of us. So those external things, they can help. They might be able to teach us the vernacular or the vocabulary, or maybe able to arm us with certain tools and subsets. But, the conversation is an internal one. So we can't expect an external conversation to do anything other than arm us, maybe inspire us, maybe, root us on and be our cheerleaders. But that internal conversation is really the only way that it truly gets addressed and navigated. And while I don't believe cure is the correct word when it comes to imposter phenomenon, to where it can be treated, improved, made better for those of us with the experience.
Absolutely. I mean, my entire relationship with the thoughts or imposter alter ego has completely changed. Now it's more of a, loving, oh, you're here again. Okay. And so I've come up with 3 principles I would like to run by you. I'm currently in the process of trademarking them, and they're going to be utilized in a keynote series I'm putting together. But the first is this whole idea that doubt is data, that if we can get ourselves out of the emotion and just start to look at any doubts that we feel as data and information, trying to give us a gift of, okay, what else do I need to know? What's it trying to tell me? It doesn't have to mean something about me, but if I can put myself into observer situation, how can this doubt actually be data that's trying to help me? Right?
I used the term lenses earlier, and I think that framework, just the vocabulary that you use, the fact that it's alliterative, I'll also really like, because that helps us remember.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's utility in that alliteration in there, that doubt is data.
Yeah.
But also it is, and the thing that I'm finding more and more is that any vocabulary, any framework that helps me recognize, remember, it's important, it's valuable, and I applaud you on putting that into the world as a tool for others to use, Kendra. That's good stuff.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll go through the next 2 real quick, and then let's get to your podcast. The second one is failure is fuel. And I created that, again, another alliteration, but the point of that was to really look at how can I reframe failure, not as it meaning something about me personally or professionally, or as a place to stop and give up, but how can that be the spark that ignites my next idea?
Yeah, I love that one.
Yeah, and then the third one is vulnerability is viral, and that's just something that I have lived and shared with leaders in teams across all these companies I've worked at as I've worked predominantly on building trust and psychological safety in teams with the essence of vulnerability. And I've seen that play out in a room, that if one leader is just willing to kind of lean in and say, you know what, I have some doubt about this, but I'm making the best decision I can right now. Or I used to have imposter syndrome, that you'll be amazed how everyone else in the room's like, oh, me too, me too. And it really is viral. It really is viral.
Well, this conversation, and I don't know, I'd love to hear what you've also found, Kendra, but what I've found is whether it was reaching out to Dr. Pauline Clance, who'd answer her phone and talk to me for 15 minutes, to yourself. I think you had there was a guest, Jill Stoddard. I've had several conversations with Jill. She's going to be a guest.
Awesome.
There's a lady in Australia that I reached out to and we connected, and she's going to be on the show. That vulnerability is viral. I think there is a shared experience that also has this interesting dynamic of that we don't talk about. So shared experience, and we're all experiencing it in a way where we think, something's wrong with me and no one else thinks like this, just me and only me. And I think there is such a relief that no matter where you're at on there, that the second you put it out into the world and you become vulnerable, there is a community
That's
of
right.
friends and fellow sufferers and experts and lay people. And I want to talk to you about a feeling that I have that I'd love to get your take on. And I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to put you in the interview chair for a second. Just the willingness for people to open up and talk about it and share their experience. I think it's because it is so incredibly therapeutic and it's so incredibly uncommon. And it's so not trained into our social structure that, shut up, buttercup, suck it up, whatever, that is the norm. And what we're doing is so abnormal, but also it's so much better, so much more powerful. It's so much more active.
It's so much easier too.
And it's so much easier
just take the mask off, right?
Yes. To share it all. So here's my question for you. And first, let me revisit I think the three things. What I have found over the years for myself is that the frameworks that someone can share with me, and I think your frameworks are I get them the second you tell them to me, and I go, I know how I can use that. And I also like the fact that they're alliterative. I'll be able to remember them. And so I feel like those frameworks are so important. I have what I'm working on, the coaching program and the book that I'm trying to write that I think will maybe be published before I die.
I feel the same about mine.
But the ideas that are kind of encapsulated, the name of the book is The Damage Advantage. And the idea is for those of us that experience this kind of imposter phenomenon, imposter syndrome, imposter thoughts, that it can take you to dark places. It can be depression and anxiety and substance abuse and self-limitation. Yes. But then there's that weird percentage of a whole lot of high-level performing, people are experiencing this. And so there's a fuel inside of there. And the damage advantage is essentially that it actually can be an advantage that you put to your use. If you're going to spend all this time in the back of your head thinking anyway, why don't you put that energy to work? And so I introduced a framework that was just beneficial to me, and it's highly alliterative. It's the 4 R's, and it begins with research and reflect. And I kind of tell the story of where I began learning and researching and understanding, and that initial conversation at the table that Kelso introduced me to the concept that kind of began the research process. And then really that reflect being a way to look backwards and recognize, where have I done that self-sabotaging? Where have I let the imposter take over? Where has it been at its worst? And start learning from there. And then those are really more sort of, in the more psychological side or in the philosophical side of the brain, on the research and reflect, understanding the phenomenon as a whole and how it plays out to you. And then in a more tactical way, recognize and remediate are the other 2 R's. And so being able to recognize in the moment when something's occurring. And then what I believe is one of the hardest things is real-time remediation, actually pulling yourself out of that, because we don't know that we're doing it when we're doing it. Otherwise, we might not do it. But we don't even have sometimes those frameworks to look through. And so mine, the 4 R's, are as much as just about my story and how my brain works. I hope they're useful. But I definitely love what you're onto. And the more that we can shove this out, whether you're a layperson, a sufferer, someone with the experience, a psychologist, classically trained with a PhD, whatever the realm is, the more people talking about it, the better, which actually gets to my question for you. Kendra, if I can ask you a question.
Of course.
So I don't have a PhD in psychology. I don't have classical training in psychology. I spent a lot of time on the couch side of the therapist relationship, but I, of course, felt the imposter kick in pretty good amounts as I started talking about it. But I'd like to, it's gonna be a strange word, but I look to the word authority. And the question that I have is, from where do you pull your authority? If someone were to say, why do you have, and almost the voice inside of our head, why do you have the right to talk about this? That's the imposter voice, I had to answer that question. How would you answer that question?
Well, thank you for the question. And I've had that question, to myself several times. And I think there's two parts to it. So the first is, again, going through my own healing journey and really doing some deep trauma healing, inner child work that then sort of perpetuated into my 20s and early 30s and was sort of rebranded, I'll call it. I've been working on that for years and years, but this last year's been explosive in terms of the amount of growth and healing that I've been able to do. And to your point, it's an onion. I'm not fully healed, quote unquote, but it's something that I actually look forward to doing each and every day, because now I recognize that I'm never done. And if I don't look at it with excitement, then that to me is a mindset that I don't want to be in. I want to be enjoying my lived experience every day and looking at things as opportunity and how am I getting better each and every day? How can I become a better version of myself each and every day? And so the reason I'm sharing that is because I had to get to that place where I rely on myself. I also am a Christian, so I have God, but really relying on myself to create my own security and becoming an authority within myself to create that for myself, which also means speaking up, which is something that I did not do well because of the imposter and my trauma, asking for what I need, setting myself up for success, being assertive. I don't care if someone calls me a bitch, being assertive, right? And being a leader, but doing it with compassion for myself and others. And so that was step one, Johnny. Step two was I have lived this for 50 years. So I would be one to argue that maybe I don't know all the clinical terms and all the reasons why XYZ is happening in the brain, although I try to do as much research on the hormones and neuroplasticity and how all these things are connected. But nothing can take away lived experience. And I believe that in my soul. And I also, as a Christian, know that God would never put me through the awful, horrendous experiences that I've been through that led to this phenomenon, to me feeling like I wanted to take my life on 2 occasions at one point, for me not to do something good with this. And for too long, I did say that to myself, Johnny. I said, well, for the last 3 years, I've wanted to launch a podcast. But who am I? I'm not a celebrity. I'm not a name. I don't have my book yet. I've never been a VP or C-suite in a Fortune 50 company, although I advise them all the time. I had all the reasons in the book to not be an authority. And then when I had my near-death experience last summer, I had already had the podcast sort of in my thoughts and writing notes on it. That was the end game for me. That was the time where I thought, what else do I have to fear? I nearly faced death, head on. And I had a lot of conversations with God in the process, and I have nothing else to fear. Like, the worst thing is that somebody doesn't listen or doesn't like it, and that's okay. But God told me and put it on my heart that, you have lived through all of this to share this story and inspire others. And so what came through for me, Johnny, that maybe will help you is that it's kind of an interesting story, but I was listening actually to Joe Rogan, and he had Mike Rowe on. Are you familiar with Mike Rowe?
Yeah.
And I loved that show. And I just think Mike Rowe comes across as such a down-to-earth person. Love to meet him one day. And he was talking about how the idea for his show was different because it wasn't a reality show where he was the star. He was just the host, and he made the guests the experts, the people that do these dirty jobs. They were the star. And in that moment, it clicked because I had already been planning my podcast. And I said, that's exactly what I want to do. I don't need to have all the answers. I don't need to know everything. I don't want to discount my authority in leadership development, executive coaching, and what I do know of human behavior, and then my lived experience. But what if I take that pressure off myself, Johnny, and I don't have to know everything? One thing I know I'm really good at is creating safe spaces for these types of conversations where we can go deeper and in directions we never thought we'd go. I'm really good at that. So what if that's all I have to bring to the table? And I bring people like you who have amazing stories and your expertise from your lived experience as well as your leadership experience and this coaching program and the formulas you're creating. And I bring in people like Dr. Jill Stoddard and I bring in neuroscientists and I get all different aspects because this show, I want it to be more of a platform to co-create and learn together, less of me just being an expert sharing what I know all the time. Nothing against people who do that on their podcast platforms. It's just not what lights me up inside. It's not my style. So that's my long answer.
I want to say that the Project Semicolon, I don't have any of the tattoos, but I'm planning on getting one. If you don't know Project Semicolon, or if listeners that are listening go find it, but the story goes on, and thank God it did for you. I understand and share an experience.
Yeah.
Congratulations on the unsuccessful component of that.
Yeah, thank you.
I found something, and ironically, the person that I'm about to talk about did commit suicide. David Foster Wallace, an incredible author from the 90s. There's an interview of him on Charlie Rose, and he's talking about being a film critic, and he's talking about David Lynch. And as they're going through the conversation, he's talking about Lynch in a very kind of analytical way. David Foster Wallace is an incredibly intelligent man, but he starts talking about, from where do I gain my authority? And I loved the conversation because it was actually something that there was utility in it when I heard it, and I realized I could apply this. And he talked about a film critic that, and I forget the lady's name, but it was a film critic that wasn't a producer, she wasn't a director, she wasn't an actor. She watched movies. She gained her authority from being in the front row as the person that experienced the movies. And he was sort of explaining it the same way, that he gains his authority to talk about this topic as someone who just loves movies, who watches movies. That's where he gains his authority. And when I ask you that question, I always go through my own brain of, what are some good ways that I can fight the imposter when it starts talking to me and saying, what are you doing this for? And who do you think you are? And you're not a psychologist. But I do think there's an incredible value that those of us that experience the phenomenon on whatever level of the spectrum that we do, and wherever our focus is, and whatever conversation we're bringing to the table, I feel like we gain our authority through the fact that we have the imposter in our brain. Mm-hmm. We have the imposter by our side, on our shoulder, in the car with us. And I do believe that's important for us to recognize that we have the right to talk about this as sufferers, and that there is a chorus out there of conversation that's occurring. Our value is in our shared experiences that we have, and the way that we personally found our way to navigate through it. So yeah, I want to commend you for what you're doing as someone who, I think, as me, you're more qualified, having been more of a trainer and a coach. But it's a little imposter triggering when you're talking to like a Jill Stoddard or a Jerry Simpkins or the OG herself, and you think, why am I taught? Who am I to speak of this? But I do think that we gain our authority through our experience of it, and that it's critical that we're talking about it. So yeah, I want to thank you for talking about it. I want to thank you for having me on to allow me to talk about it.
Of course. Do you mind sharing your age?
I'm 52.
Okay. Do you have a calculator near you? I don't have my phone.
Let's see. I do indeed.
What's 52 times 365?
180.
Do you think that PhDs and neuroscientists have lived
18,980 days.
Days, not even hours. Do you think they put in that much into living and breathing imposter syndrome, probably fighting every day of their life, Johnny, to figure out how the hell to get out of this hellhole that we're in?
That's it. I think that's
your PhD right there, brother.
What another incredible framework of, when you go to think about it, putting in that quantification. We can talk about it in some nebulous way.
That's right.
But 19,000 days, give or take, whatever that translates into hours and seconds and minutes.
That's right.
Powerful.
And we know how painful those moments can be when you're breathing in and out, and an hour feels like a day. So just go back to that.
There's our experience.
And I'm no more trained than you are. It's just about how we position ourselves, and a lot of that's marketing, right?
I like that. Yeah, I like that. That's just a story we're telling in our
And I'm not saying that PhDs don't have cred. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just saying that we've all seen where in the coaching world, even I've seen where people will sign up to work with a coach that has a year of experience coaching because they have a doctor in front of their name over someone like myself, for instance, who had 15 years. And it used to bother me. And then now I'm like, oh, there's enough of us and, everyone finds their own and whatever. But what I realize is that that's what that person is looking for. They want that doctor. They want that credibility. There's something inside of them that either needs that in a coach in that moment in time, which is fine for them to do, or that's potentially a bias or a trigger that they have. And so we have to be careful of when we're using it against ourselves too, right?
I like that.
Yeah.
And I would agree. I mean, I'm a fan of credentials in certain areas, but for this conversation specifically, our credentials are the wounds that we have and the 18,980 days that we've spent or that I've spent, and those are our credentials as well. And back to the point of, this is a critical conversation that there needs to be a chorus,
I
not
agree.
just a group of pundits,
Yep.
the experts that are weighing in, but it needs to be a chorus. And I'm seeing that, and I'm excited that I see more and more of it. We talked a little bit about at one point in our earlier conversations around, saturation, and I think there's a lot more people talking about it than ever have been, but I also think there's plenty of room. And I speak to people that are waking up to it all the time. And so I say the more the merrier.
Yeah. And we were talking before we started recording about yesterday, Stephen Bartlett's post from Diary of a CEO. I mean, one of my favorite podcasters. I assume you follow him as well. I mean, I think it's probably every podcaster's dream to be able to sit across the table from him one day. And he came out and was talking about how he felt that he was having quote unquote imposter syndrome when he met Michelle Obama to do his recent interview with her. And so I think it's just kudos to him for having the courage and gumption just to come out and say, hey, I feel this, and guess what? It's normal. I mean, he's saying all the things that we're saying is like, look, this is just part of our leadership journey. This is part of the process.
One of my favorite podcasters, and he's not for everybody. He's polarizing, but Scott Galloway, Prof G Markets. He's a professor at NYU Stern. He's written several books. He's actually got a book coming out addressing the sort of crisis among young men, and specifically in current society, some of the challenges that really aren't being talked enough about as they should be, about how young men are suffering with certain things. End of the day, he's a professor of marketing. He's written a couple of books, but his podcast, Off G Markets, he brings on all sorts of people. One person he brought on, the organizational psychologist, Adam Grant. And they literally have a section about imposter syndrome. And Scott, part of the reason why he's polarizing is because I think you see his imposter syndrome come out in certain ways, and there's certain very rebellious things that I think he's trying to sort of cope with his own feelings of imposter, and it can be a little vulgar at times.
Fascinating.
But he's completely self-aware of it, and he calls it out on himself, and he says, I can do it. And I think it's sort of a coping mechanism for him. But I've found a lot of instruction from that podcast, just watching someone that is very self-deprecating, has all the classical signs of imposter syndrome, and like, you see the good and the bad of that on his show manifest in real time. Adam Grant, always elegant, always, but you never see the dark side of Adam Grant, or at least I don't think it. But Scott Galloway, you'll see it's a fascinating study of watching the good and bad of someone navigating imposter syndrome and how that can come out in such a
and we soothe in different ways, and sometimes the soothing is helpful and sometimes it's not. It's right. And so that's really fascinating. So on the topic of podcasts, let's finally get to your podcast. I would love for you to tell us a little bit about your podcast, and we can talk a little bit about how people can find it.
Yeah, so it was the Impodsters, little tongue in cheek. We want to use a little humor on it and be cheeky and clever. But you'll see the hat here. is the Imposters. You can find us anywhere you find your favorite podcasts. So there's three of us right now that are co-hosts. One is a longtime friend. One is someone who literally the day I filed for the trademark, I met this person for lunch. We had a shared client in common and didn't know each other, but had met in passing and said we should get together. One of my hosts had lunch with him. I was explaining what I was doing and that I'd filed for this trademark. And I asked him, do you know anything about the imposter syndrome? And he's like, absolutely. I live it every single day and I need to be on your podcast. And I was like, well, why don't you come be a host? And then the other host, he is a podcaster. He has a movie podcast called Movie Wars, which is a great podcast. He's a comedian, so he brings levity. And so it's the three of us going through a shared experience, three grown men talking about their feelings. So that's a joy ride. We would be remiss if we just talked to the experts and the people that have written and published their books and that have their PhDs. That's not the goal. The goal will be that we're going to mix it up with those who suffer, those who experience, those who are experts, and even the ability to pull in people that are, I don't feel it, but I love someone who does, or I don't experience it.
I love that you're doing it. Like I said, there can't be enough voices in this space. One thing really came to mind for me to further emphasize this idea that you have to be an expert to have a podcast, or you have to be an expert to go do the thing you want to do. And I'm saying this to myself right now as much as I'm saying it to you, Johnny, and the listeners. Think of the value in customer journey mapping. We go to the customer to get the real story, to get the data. A company may know what it needs to do. It may have experts in marketing, but where they get the best data, the most real data is actually from the user experience, from the customer. So you and I, in essence, are just the user. We're just the customer experience, right? So that's just as valuable. So don't from doing the thing you want to do is my message.
I love that. I can't say that I've ever thought about it that way before, but what truth lies there that when, and the flip side of that is the danger of, product development and never going and talking to your client. Who knows what you're going to get? This decision and the glass tower that gets made, by the time it gets to the client's like, this isn't what I want. So what incredible utility there is in that concept that we're the user experience. Of course we should be talking about.
That's right. See the beauty of creating space together, having a vulnerable conversation, reflecting back on everything you know, and looking at where you want to go. How will you look towards how you're going to be worthy versus do worthy?
Wow. That's a complicated one. I'm 52. I do not fool myself into thinking that I am middle-aged. At best, I'm 2/3 aged. And so I think maybe that's part of it. Is one tool is to prepare to die is prepare to live. And so I've looked at my mortality and I've tried to realize that how important it is to really enjoy this next phase of life, some of the successes that I've had and some of the freedoms that it's giving me is really important. I think one thing along the way that I learned that I think is going to be more in play than ever is to understand who I am through nothing but the lens of who I am, not what I've achieved, what I've accomplished, the car I drive, the zip code I live in, the Rolex on my arm, like all these things are through the course of my experience. They may have become like the things that I own me has been a lesson. The yardsticks that I use, the externalities that I apply towards myself that were never all that healthy or good. I think one thing that I'm trying to answer now is how do I define myself by only that, who I am, what I do, what I believe, my values, when I talk about my accomplishments, it's not what did you do and did you win or lose? Did you impact change in somebody or something, or in your tiny little corner of the world, did you change something? So I think that's really where I'm going to spend a lot of time and focus. And what's ironic is I'm going to do the same things I've always done. I'm starting a new company, involved in a couple of organizations, doing a lot of the things that I've always done. And it's really not what I'm doing, It's more about the how and the why that I'm doing it, and entering that phase of fulfillment and purpose and understanding the worth of myself just as that, not through actions or wins or losses, is the next phase. Won't say I've got it figured out, not saying I'm accomplishing the goal, but I understand what the goal is, and that being at peace with that piece of it and finding that contentment and purpose and mission and vision truly through who am I is the next phase that I'm gonna be navigating. So I'll take your help, Kendra.
That was a masterclass in redefining self-worth internally versus externally.
Tough lesson to get there. Again, I'll get my semicolon tattoo. Take a look. Project semicolon. Okay. Throw that in the notes if you have that they know what I speak of. But anyone who's experienced either through a loved one or through themselves suicide attempt, suicidal ideation, Project semicolon does some great work. And
then lastly, the Impodsters, you're available on Spotify and Apple. Where else can they find you and your coaching program, Tony?
We're firing up our YouTube channel soon, and you can find us on both LinkedIn, because a portion of what we talk about is really related to the business world. So we do have a profile on LinkedIn, and you can also find us on Facebook.
So much for spending this time with me today. I feel like my soul just got massaged. I love having conversations like this.
Thank you so much. And I keep up your efforts. Keep shouting from the rooftops and being a part of that chorus. And any way that I can help you in your initiatives, I'll ask you to do the same. And hopefully anyone listening that is a part of the chorus, reach out to us. We seem to be a growing community, and one that seems to have an unbelievable willingness to help one another. So Kendra, thank you for the work you do. And thank you for having me on the podcast.
It's a pleasure. I look forward to having you back.